Hi there, I'm Cary Ellis, author of 21st Century Superhuman. This is our 21st Century Superhuman show. And today I have with me one of the really bright minds of our times, Peter Moon. Peter, how are you today?
Oh, I'm fine, thank you.
It's great to have you here with me. And your work is just, I have discovered it to be just some of the most amazing work for you. You're a prolific author. You're an incredibly good writer. You're an amazing historian, and I think anyone who wants to know about our kind of arcane history, our deeper history, ancient secrets, what got us to today, that we can really use as a springboard to carry us into a more intelligent future. You know, what are the lessons that came from that? Where have we already delved in to some of the really amazing secrets of our capabilities? Those are covered in your books. And man, I just want to jump up and down and grab people and say, come on, you've got to read Peter Moon's stuff because it's so amazing. And you have the website skybooksusa.com, and which we will put under this video. And I know you also have many of your books that are up on Amazon. So Peter, would you like to just share with us a little bit about how you got into this? I know you have a couple of co-authors. The depth of material is really, really real. I just sit there and go, wow, how did this guy even come up with all of this? So the detail that you write in, and I know you present a lot of it as fiction, although I know it really, much of it is not. Give us a little background on how you got here. Where is all this coming from?
Okay, and I want to mention a key website to look at is Time Travel Education Center,
yes,
which we've gone over for your audience before. But anyway, what I bring to the table is not only an understanding of the occult, but from a reference point of not only having studied from people who have penetrated the occult, have corridors of the occult. I've had the experience to penetrate some of these corridors myself. And these, while that sounds kind of vague and kind of mysterious, these corridors of the human mind that we do not ordinarily have access to if we're a run-of-the-mill human being have been patterned and mapped out since ancient history. And people who study them sometimes get enlightened and sometimes go into a borderline state of enlightenment and sometimes get taken over. So it's a adventurous area to travel in, and yes. I've had X degree amount of success in traversing the area from my background, which is certainly a unique background. And I will just mention it briefly here right now. I have a debt of gratitude to the very controversial character who I worked personally for, L. Ron Hubbard, who studied the psychology of mankind in conjunction with the military. And he, right now, as we speak, there's a lot of controversy swirling in the media. And most of this controversy is being fostered and brought to bear by people who have been victims of the cult of Scientology. And it's what these people are is they're damaged goods. And they're damaged goods by reason of certain forces that L. Ron Hubbard was in alignment with and which he endeavored to harness and employ by his own statement for the betterment of mankind. Some people will not agree with that. But what I would tell you, it doesn't matter what his intent was. It's all about what you do with what you learn. What you do with what you learn. And certainly, I learned enough to be able to go on my own way well before he passed away, and carve out my own niche in life and fulfill my own destiny, which was not to emulate him, or be like him, but to, you know, figure out my own destiny and help the destiny of others. And it led to one of his big goals, which was to be control over time. He used to talk about being control over matter, energy, space, and time. Well, his control over time and what he offered on it was mostly in the mental sphere. Now I'm moving into a sphere which is in the realm of objective time. So, you know, that's a little bit about how I got here. There are many interesting side tunnels, so to speak, and threads that keep, like say, you specifically wanted to talk about one of my books today, the Spandau Mystery, which is the only novel I've ever written. And there's a very interesting story behind how that was written, if you would like to hear it, because you wanted to talk about Spandau Mystery today.
Definitely. And let's just give a little introduction that you've been very involved in writing things just before you go into the Spandau Mystery, specifically about the Montauk Project, which was a place where the U.S. was, or some different probably factions were practicing time travel off of Long Island in New York.
In collaboration with German Nazis.
Correct. And then Transylvania or Romania, where there is another pyramid and a sphinx. So you've focused in some very key points on the planet. And not to go off on that as a side note, but to just give some background, some of this material is coming from this kind of work. And so go ahead and introduce the Spandau Mystery, and then I have a little story I'll share before we jump into that too far.
Okay. The Montauk Project, as it was told to me, as I first heard about it in 1990 from Preston Nichols and Al Bielek and Duncan Cameron, and they often mentioned this was a control project that involved controlling the mind of man, the psyche of man, amplifying the psychic abilities of man, and using it to harness time and time travel. The project was studied with a lot of mysteries, one of which was a strong contingent of Nazis in the Montauk area and in the Montauk Project. Now, I was very fascinated with the Nazi thread. And the Nazi thread led me to the revelation that the New York State approved and funded an effort to recover Nazi gold at Montauk Camp Hero. I think this was in the 70s, but they funded it. They claimed they didn't find anything because of all the stories of Nazis burying gold there. Well, whatever gold the Nazis brought aboard were spent, according to George Dixon, who said that he ran a portfolio for the Montauk Project, a gold portfolio that was all the gold from that was taken from a train in Strasbourg, France, that I think Patton intercepted, was taken, eventually found its way to Long Island, and it was used to fund the Montauk Project. It was Nazi gold, according to George, who was deeply involved in the project. He was identified as Mr. X in my book, Montauk Revisited. He passed away a couple of years ago. I got to see him just a week before his death. But anyway, the Nazi connection, I wrote a book about it called The Black Sun, Montauk's Nazi-Tibetan connection, because the Nazis are very much tied to Tibet. And this does concern the book. But so basically, that book, Black Sun, was written in 1990, published in 1997. Montauk Project was published in 1992. I think it was about 2006 or thereabouts, maybe 2007, that I finished the Spandau Mystery, which had taken me 2 years to write. And the Spandau Mystery was a novel. And the reason I wrote a novel, I'd always wanted to write a novel. That was my original, I guess, idea as a writer. But I had this very interesting doctor who I met one time. Her name was Magdalena. She was Chinese, from the Philippines, and she had a great gift. She would go around the world, and she would work, like she'd go to China and she would be working on the president of China because she had gifted healing abilities, okay? And she became my friend. She became somebody I would bring my family to if they had an illness. She treated everybody for free too, you know? She had a passion for humanity.
Right.
She didn't need money. She had about several pensions, a very tough life. You know, her husband tried to kill her for the insurance, a very troubled life, all sorts of dilemmas. She did get to meet my friend, Dr. David Anderson. Because I remember she drove the shaman out for this, this is where David actually revealed the time reactor, videos of the time reactor in its early stages at Montauk, New York in April of 2010. And she got to meet him, Magdalena. But anyway, Magdalena was working on me one time and she says, you know, you need to write a fiction book. You should have written this, you should write as fiction. It will be a movie. She inspired me to do this idea that I'd had, which was to write, I mean, from a business standpoint, the Montauk Project probably should have been written as fiction, just pure fiction. But that's beside the point. Her idea, so what I did was, I took all these threads I had in my different writing, one of which was this Nazi thread to Montauk. Also the research I'd done for the Black Sun, because I had been to Germany. I don't remember if I went to Germany. I think I went to Germany after I wrote Spandau Mystery for the second time. I was actually, I did a lecture there at a conference. I think I'd written the book, I don't remember, but that research that I learned in Germany did not go into this book. But anyway, I had the German thread, I had the Montauk thread, and I had what I call the Moorish thread, the Moors. The Moors are a very important element of history that has been lost. They contain many of the secrets.
Yes.
Many of the secrets, and people don't understand the Moors. I just went to see a movie. It just came out. It's called The Assassin's Creed, based upon a game. And I went to see it for research purposes. And the movie, which has too much violence, and for me it got very boring at the end. My wife, however, loved it. But I pointed out to her, and she did not understand this, the history is completely screwed up. Now, it is a fiction movie, but it's diabolic what they did with the fiction of how they positioned the Templars and the Assassins. And omit the Moors. And it's all about Andalusia in Spain. The Moors were the ruling factor and cultural factor of Andalusia. And they don't even mention the Moors. So this was shameful from a perspective of truth. And one reviewer said about the movie, he says, the greatest mystery of this movie is how so many talented actors, why they would participate in such a movie. Anyway, some people might like it, and I don't know that it does justice to the game, but I'm not that familiar with the game. Anyway, the Moors are a very important piece of history. So what I did in these threads, this book, I took 3 threads. And the reason I took these threads is because these threads in nonfiction have loose ends. And they're loose ends that are not so easy to find by going through normal history or ordinary documentation. I did these threads with fiction. So because when you start connecting these threads, and I will discuss what the threads are in a minute, you begin to actually wake up the energy behind the historical character. This is what fiction can do if you're being true to honoring the spirit of the fictional character. And I had 3 characters that I was tying here together. One was Rudolph Hess, and I explained some of the actual history of Rudolf Hess. One of them was George Patton. One of them was Aleister Crowley, and another one, the most important one, was a Noble Drew Ali, a Moorish, the first recognized prophet of Islam in America, recognized prophet. And he took the world by storm, the so-called black world by storm in the early 1900s. He was so popular that they created a whole radio show. It was the first nationally syndicated radio show in the history of the United States to spoof science, and they called Amos and Andy. And they even made fun of him in one of the shows, changed his name to Ali Bendo and made him a crystal gazer. And I went into the history of that in the book, The Synchronicity and the Seventh Seal, which includes both historical and fictional elements in it. And the beauty of that book, Synchronicity and the Seventh Seal, when I talk about honoring the spirits of historical characters, well, what happened? I got the actual descendants of these characters contact me and become friends of mine and lead me on further adventures in my real life, and enabled the discovery of my Romanian adventures to take place. Without the Moors, I can't say that it would have happened, because they led me to Qigong. The first one to tell me that I could go to this daily classes of Qigong with my teacher, even though I bet the teacher was this woman who grew up in the Moorish Science Temple. I'm telling her about my book. She says, well, I grew up in the Moorish Science Temple. Oh, by the way, yeah, you can go to these classes. You should come to the classes. I said, oh, you have classes in the morning? Yeah, tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock, boom. So, yes, this is how the Moors were so important to my work, and they still are. Their threads are often obscure, and they, but they're very fascinating. Now, so I picked a day in history, and it was not an arbitrary day, but it was a day in April 2000. I don't remember if it was 2003 or 2004, but it was a day that, according to observable history, Noble Drew Ali was in Egypt and around the pyramid. Aleister Crowley was in Egypt and around the pyramid. Of course, Patton wasn't in Egypt at that time. And Rudolph Hess could have been. Now, he was definitely in Egypt because he grew up in Alexandria. So in this fictional scenario, I have Rudolph Hess as a young boy being taken by his father to go down and see the pyramids. And they are all staying at the same hotel for different reasons. Crowley is there to do his experiments with his wife. This becomes the great magical working that would result in his Book of the Law. Noble Drew Ali is there as sort of an innocent, somebody who stumbled, was taken into the Great Pyramid for an initiation, was left on his own with a blindfold. He didn't know how to get out, and they expect you to die during that initiation. But they found him between the paws of the Sphinx, and he was heralded as a great leader. And the book concerns one of his associates or descendant associates, and then how all of this energy mixes in with Patton and Hess. So that's a little of the book, but I go into historical threads. I create it with real drama that includes the Montauk Project. And where the book ends is the most interesting of all, but we're just getting into the meat of the book. But go ahead. So I've given an overview of how the book came to be.
Peter, again, your sense of detail is just amazing. And the way you can relate these details, connect them, weave them together. And that is what's really so great about your work. I just want to read every single one of your books and then go back and read them again, because there's so many threads of history that you're tying together in a very intelligent, way that is also really applicable to our now. And I think that's what we need to keep coming back to, is these stories and this history is really applicable to where we are now in human history, where we're capable of going with it. And
let me explain this. I don't remember the word right now, but this is part of what I call the barbershop mirror technique. A lot of my writing might have a footnote, a sentence, a paragraph, or even a chapter that has a barbershop mirror effect all in of itself. And I see this when I put it in. That's why I put it in, because it's like it's got a mirror going back and forth, because there are these very rich components of consciousness which have threads that I haven't even had time to explore. Although I can see that there's like an ore of gold to mine, and I put it in there for that exact reason, because I can see it with my, through my pineal gland or third eye or whatever you want to call it. I can see these things and I can see their value. But, how much time, when you're going by the ride in Disneyland, how much time do you need to look at that scale, that scope of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs? You've got to move on to the next, vignette and see that as you're going on some sort of roller coaster. So it's like,
yeah, I think you do a really good job of mixing those things. And, I say sometimes I get sucked out of my body because I'm getting energetic downloads and I'm integrating things. And I just spent 36 hours before doing this show with you, reading the Spandau Mystery, watching a few of your videos in the time travel site. What is the time travel site again called?
TimeTravelEducationCenter.com.
TimeTravelEducationCenter.com. And that's so well put together. And I love it that a lot of the videos are short, so you can just grasp, something without having to sit there for an hour, 6 minutes or 10 minutes or 2 minutes, and you're getting these downloads. So that's a really great education center, and I will again put that link below the video. But when I went in there, you and I were discussing doing a show again, and we've done a couple of shows before. I'll make sure those links are under this video as well. And I looked in the time travel site, and all of a sudden I saw Rudolph Hess and Tibet. And I was like, oh my God, I need to see those. And then you responded and said, well, you need to read the Spandau Mystery. So I set about to read that. I couldn't put it down. I'll just tell a really quick story here, because as I was writing my book 4 years ago, which is 21st Century Superhuman, and I was in this state where I was really doing a download integration kind of thing. I sat with a scarf wrapped around my head all day long from very early in the morning till very late at night and just wrote all day. And my friend would come and knock on the window and say, how are you today? And I'd say, I'm not the same person I was yesterday. So I was in this deep alchemical change myself as I wrote the book. And the book is about that we are in the shift of the ages, what the ancients called the shift of the ages. We're waking up to many things, which include that this is a holographic world that we are capable of creating in. And, we know of the teachings of Tibet to be these teachings of how do we go beyond what's seen in the physical. And when I saw that link between Rudolf Hess, Rudolf Hess in Tibet, Rudolf Hess came to me when I was writing my book. And the story, I had this story in the book at one point. Several people said, oh, you shouldn't have the story of a Nazi in there, and because people won't get it. But basically one day I opened up my computer, I sat down to write. No one had any access to the manuscript except myself. The person who I have on the book as contributor is Teddy Mulder, who's been a friend for many years because we're in dialogue all the time. So she had nothing to do with the actual writing. So as I opened up the manuscript to start writing on it, right in front of me on the page were these words, and I was speaking about changing events in time. And these words on the page were, we know no time. Speak more to the arc of the Hess. And I read those words, and I went in the house and I said, Teddy, I said, did you by any chance, you don't even know how to use a computer. I mean, where did these words come from on the page? And we sat down, and it was like we were getting Shakti. You know, when a lot of energy comes in from the source field that is us accessing our higher state. We were laughing like crazy. Her grandson said, what are you girls laughing about in there? And when we came out of the laughter, I started searching online for Ark of the Hess, and then I didn't see anything. So then I searched for Hess, and the first thing that came up was Hess surfboards, and I kind of cast that aside. The second thing that came up was Hess, a Jewish man who decided to start a petroleum company, but he did it in the Virgin Islands so he wouldn't have to pay U.S. taxes. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And the third one was Rudolf Hess, and I went, oh, Rudolf Hess. And so I started flipping into this information on Rudolf Hess, and the first thing I saw was a picture of him as a young man. And I said, oh my God, a longtime friend of Teddy's was born in Germany, does not know who his father was, and looked very much like this picture of Rudolf Hess. And that was what pulled me into the material. It was just in Wikipedia on Rudolf Hess. And I said, look, this looks like our friend. And all of a sudden, I flipped into being in an airplane flying over the green hills of Scotland with waves crashing on the shore and cliffs beside me and a castle out in front of me. And I was like, and I started telling Teddy this story. And then I read more down the page, and I read that Rudolf Hess decided in 1941 he didn't want to participate in the war, that he would go make peace with England. He went and got flying lessons. He flew across the North Sea, and he crash landed on the green hills of Scotland. I was like, oh my God, okay, Rudolf Hess is here with us. And there were a whole lot of other things that kind of unfolded in that digging into Rudolf Hess, but it was like as if I got this distinct message that I was getting telepathically, and it said, you need to write into this chapter that you can go into any timeline. You can bring love into anything that happened in the timeline, including the desecration of the Jews during World War II or anything else you want to choose. And you can delete or change that experience in that timeline. You can kind of neutralize it. And interestingly enough, I have a quote in my book where Nassim Haramein says something similar. You can take love into any place in any timeline. And that became a very strong chapter in my book at that point. So as soon as I saw in your time travel site, this thing, Rudolf Hess and the Tibetans, I just knew I had to know what that material was. And when I got actually watching the videos that you have sequestered there in that site are amazing. And I began to realize that there is an ancient culture hidden away in Tibet that was transmitting information to the Nazis that allowed them to come out with all these advanced technologies way ahead of time, which have actually hugely influenced our culture today, and why that was happening. But then the depth of these stories about Patton, Aleister Crowley, you even have Ian Fleming in there, Winston Churchill, Rudolf Steiner. I mean, it's an amazing interweaving of history. And you had said to me, you know, Rudolf Hess is often misaligned and people have no idea who he was. And through reading of this book, I get that he was, and also when Hitler put him in prison and said this is the greatest, you know, most terrible treason that's ever happened after he flew off to England.
Hitler didn't put him in prison, the British did.
The British
Hitler officially disowned him, officially.
Okay. And then I heard that Hitler had 100 psychics killed, psychics and astrologers, because he didn't want Rudolf Hess to be communicating with the other side as he usually did. But anyway, that's enough of my story, but it was what...
So much of what has been said about Hitler was war propaganda. So it's hard to say what's true and what's not.
Right.
You know, the quintessential Nazi war historian, I think his name is Hugh Trevor Roper, was an agent for the military. I mean, he was an agent. He was operating on a military intelligence agenda. So anyway, you have to cast all that aside in your preconceived notions about the Nazis. With regard to the Ark of Hess, it's a term I've not heard, but what it would most definitely relate to is the House of Orange, or Orange Hess, in the Netherlands area, because these ancient things weren't called the Netherlands, it was called Orange, the Duchy of Orange, or whatever it was called. And Hess is from that family of, now I've written about the connection to Orange, the House of Orange in Montauk, and Sir Lionel Gardner. The Gardners married into the Montauk Indians, the royal faction. They wanted the royal blood of the Montauk Indians. So there's a big connection between the House of Orange and the throne of England. King George III eventually marrying Charlotte, who was Moorish. You know, she was Moorish. They wanted blood. And King George III, who suffered from blue bloods disease, porphyria, he would pee purple. He was actually a great friend to the Indians. And the English were friends to the Indians. And they, you know, that's a whole, and the colonists were trying to develop the area of what is mostly Kentucky as Transylvania. They were going to call it Transylvania. And they, King George stopped this. This was going to be the 14th colony, because you were not supposed to take land that was Indians and acquire it or sell it or buy it. So anyway, the House of Orange is a very mysterious. There was also the Orange Cameron, and Cameron's a name that features in there. But the Hess, the Ark of Hess would be tied to this. We also have the Hessians, who came here to fight the Americans, paid for by the British. So Hess, Orange, and England were very tied together.
So an interesting whole other avenue I can go down to.
This is why, part of why he felt it was safe to go to England and contact the Duke of Hamilton, who he knew. One book, The Pink Swastika, suggests a sexual relationship between Karl Hausover's son, Albrecht Hausover, and the Duke of Hamilton. The Hausovers and Hess were very close. Hausover sponsored Hess. Karl Hausover was a very key player in the Bavarian Illuminati. The Illuminati, the historical Illuminati, not the stuff they talk about in New Age gobbledygook, but the historical Illuminati that was started by Adam Weishaupt and was followed up by a man named Giuseppe Mazzini, who was the one who overthrew the Papal States and formed the country of Italy. But paved the way for Mussolini, who eventually restored the Vatican. He brought the Vatican, you know, he made the Vatican credible again as an entity, because the Papal States had been overthrown. The Vatican was like this small little place that was subject to abuse. And he rehabilitated it and turned it into a financial clearinghouse. And he was aided in this by Marconi. Marconi was a big proponent of fascism and of the Vatican.
Why don't we go a little, let's go back into the Spandau Mystery, because we're kind of going down a whole nother trail here. Which
a part of this player where Hess came into, very important part of the book, is that Hess was chosen as the financier, or the finance go-to guy, you know.
Plus it was amazing that he was Egyptian.
Well, he lived in Egypt.
Lived in Egypt, okay. So he was from the Netherlands, but lived in Egypt.
His father was a successful merchant who operated out of Alexandria, Egypt. And Hess grew up in Egypt. I don't know that his nationality was Egyptian, I couldn't say, but he was in Alexandria, which is a port city.
And so you did say they did a lot to kind of erase his history, sort of.
Oh, yes, but most important in his history was not only that he was the finance, like he was the financial conduit between the Nazi Party and the Bavarian Illuminati. And he was the signatory, he was the financial officer of the Nazi Party. He was a signatory on all the accounts. So when he was taken to England, or when he flew to England, and he thought that he would have some form of diplomatic respect, Churchill locked him up and wouldn't talk to him. Very pissed. He thought that he could talk to Churchill. He thought that he had some form of diplomatic rights. But, you know, England was at war, and they treated him as a prisoner of war. And so Hess was problematic, because they couldn't try him for war crimes, because he wasn't part of that. The war got going, and he wasn't, traceable to so many of these war crimes that took place, because most of what took place after he left.
Right.
They could get him on a few things, which people said they were trumped up, and they certainly didn't justify life in prison. So Hess was a great embarrassment to the Allies, because he was the signatory of the Nazi Party, and he had access, signatory-wise, to all of their accounts. His signatory was never revoked because he was the signatory to all the bank accounts.
So do you think he was kind of a repository for some of that arcane information, or I'd say advanced scientific information that came from Tibet?
Yes, he was not credited with having a scientific mind, but he was the sponsor of the Vril Society.
Right.
Created all these Nazi UFOs, which was also said to be channeled through these Vril women. Vril being a Tibetan word and term, and the
and Vril meaning, I got that it meant will, our the energy that we can move with our will. Is that right? Or
chi.
Yeah, chi.
It's
Right.
life energy.
Gotcha.
Superman possessed the Vril when he would look at you and
Right.
The eyes through lead, burned through lead or whatever. But so anyway, the Hess was a very key character. So if they couldn't release him, because he would have ostensibly had signatory power to these accounts, and which were eventually transferred to Martin Bormann, who became party secretary, and he sort of moved in on that. And Bormann was a whole big problem to them as well, which is covered very extensively in the book Operation JB, or James Bond, which I integrated some of those themes into the narrative of certainly did my own take on Ian Fleming, who was an international banker. Ian Fleming was codenamed James Bond in what was called Operation James Bond or Operation James B. And he went in to get to Martin Bormann, and they took him out of the bunker and brought him to safety so they could have signatory power to his accounts. And nobody ever knows what happens to those accounts. In the book by Christopher Creighton, who was a part of the mission with James Bond, because he had the contacts in Germany. He grew up with Ribbentrop, the finance minister, as knowing him as his uncle. He was English. Basically, what happens with accounts of resources, they are given to Captain, or what's his name, Colonel Wild Bill Donovan, and a man named Desmond Morton. Desmond Morton was the equivalent of Wild Bill Donovan in England. He ran their special ops. And they were both, unusually for Desmond Morton, he was a devout Catholic, as was Donovan. They were both members of the Knights of Columbus. So all this money went to agents of the Knights of Columbus. In other words, it went back to the Vatican, so to speak, or the control of the Vatican, which was again a financial clearinghouse for Mussolini or the Illuminati.
Right.
So this is, the money went back. It went through the Allied hands, through Donovan and Desmond Morton. And according to the book, they don't know what happened to it. And of course, Hess was, but back to your question about technology, he not only sponsored the Vril flying saucers, he would give extensive lectures on them because he understood the technology. And when he was in prison in Spandau, by the way, is the name of the prison that was in Berlin, where they imprisoned the Nazis after the Nuremberg trials, the key Nazis, the head Nazis, like Albert Speer and Admiral Donitz, Karl Donitz. And so anyway, Hess had, the Nazi scientists who were now at NASA would write to Hess, and they would tell him technical details about the moon and stuff like this, because he was a technical peer. Even though he didn't have a science degree, he was a peer. They treated him as a peer of science.
Wow.
And he was, of course, killed, murdered in prison. He was very old. I don't know how many years he had left. but he was murdered in prison. There's been whole books written about that because they kept Spandau Mystery open, Spandau Prison open just for him. Everybody else had been dismissed or died.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And he was like 92 or 93, I think, right?
I think 93.
Yeah.
So he's a fascinating character.
Yeah, I have a feeling he must have been a repository for some very complex and interesting information. It seems like he must have known, because he was already into it even before the war started. He was already into the, you know, the arcane or whatever.
He was into the occult.
The occult.
As was Hitler, and his mentor was Karl Hausover, who was a Tibetan Bonpo priest.
Wow.
And see, it was Karl Hausover who understood languages like Japanese, and I think he spoke Tibetan, but he was a Tibetan priest. He formed the alliance with the Axis. He was a general in, I don't know if it was the first, I think it was the First World War, but he was a general back in some of these early conflicts, and he had an alliance with the Japanese going back to the early 1900s. Karl Hausover, and he formed the alliance with the Axis, so he was incredible, and he was very knowledgeable about the occult, particularly from a Tibetan perspective, and he understood the Japanese culture as well. He was also a friend and colleague of Aleister Crowley. So, you know, he was a major operator who was not necessarily so visible. And he was a professor of geopolitics at Munich University, where he met Hess, and Hess was his pupil. And Hess introduced him to Hitler, where he met him in the Landsberg prison.
Mm. So who do you think this Tibetan group were that were giving this information to the Germans?
Well, what you're referring to there specifically is these videos that are on the website, timetraveleducationcenter.com. I think they might be by subscription. They can also be found on YouTube if you know where to look. I put them on my site because they disappear off of YouTube. They disappear off my other sites. I have a secure site now. But Hess, in those videos, which were prepared, transcribed from Russian into Romanian and then into English by my friends in Romania. They did this for me. They took a lot of labor.
Nice.
To get these videos, which were in Russian, and they transcribed them from Romanian into English for me.
Nice.
And they show this story of this character, Sahib, who is the go-between to bring the technology from the Tibetans to the Germans. And he brings the technology to the niece, or it's the nephew of Rudolf Hess, and the niece of Joseph Goebbels.
Right, right.
The technology to these kids, and they're like little. It's like, I think it's like a telescope that looks like that has television technology, and the Germans, it's their challenge to figure out this technology, and they do. They had TV before anybody, and here you have this video telling us the technology, and you don't even hear that Germans had TV before we did, but you find out that it's coming from Tibetans. The Tibetans play a very dubious role as you see the Tibetans unfold in the videos, because it's sort of like they have this attitude is, okay, we give this technology to mankind and let's see how it works out, you know, and it's like they're allowing all of this war to take place.
Right.
They're enabling it, at least through omission.
Right.
And it does not put them in a very desirable light, in my opinion.
So when we say the Tibetans, as they appear in your story, I mean, is it like from the general populace of Tibet? Is it where the Dalai Lama comes from, or is this some other group, do you think? I mean, do you know? It's amazing that
the Dalai Lama is one of the biggest red herrings in geopolitics. In other words, he's like, people think he's this and that in Tibet, and he gets all this glory and all this adulation, but he is really an imposter to indigenous or traditional Tibet. But he gets all the limelight. He was smuggled out of Tibet by the CIA, and he's been aligned with the CIA since that very day. That doesn't mean everything he has to say is wrong, but certainly if you look up the dark side of the Dalai Lama, you might be surprised. Just like if you look up the dark side of Mohandas Gandhi, he was a British tool of propaganda to divide and conquer India in the name of restoring India, in the name of giving it its independence, while they were really dividing it.
I guess that comes back to the topic of, how do you move masses of people in a certain direction? And it seems like these Tibetans, whoever they were, that gave this technology to the Germans in World War II, were dispensing that to kind of nudge them a new direction and say, let's toss this out there and see what these people do with it. And then, of course, some of what was done with it was probably not so great. And
I will share something with you, what I think, and this came to me on an intuitive revelation. And it occurred to me last summer when I was going to the sacred area of Transylvania, Sarmisegetusa. I was going there, and my wife and I traveled separately. And she would stay with her family, and then she would meet up with me. When she would meet up with me, her spiritual mother it happened by happenstance that this master Sergei, who's one of the most famous Romanian psychics, he's on TV a lot, so he's famous. He was with them, and he actually had a very beautiful wedding gift for me. And he told me, he does not speak English. He speaks Russian, and he's a Bonpo initiate. He's been initiated by the Bonpo, which is the indigenous tradition of which Tibetan Buddhism patterned itself after. And I should also say that the Dalai Lama was installed originally, going back, not this Dalai Lama, by the Chinese. So anyway, this Master Sergei was a Bonpo initiate. He worked with the Bonpo, and he spoke Russian, and so all of his communication was in Russian with the Tibetans. So the Tibetans speak Russian, many of them do. And he basically said that there's a lot of strings between the government of Russia and the Tibetans, meaning the Bonpos, not the Dalai Lama. And when he said that, it became evident to me that Tibet has strings into every government in the world. He didn't say that, and I clarified that, and he said, no, I didn't say that. But it came evident to me that these are old, ancient, because Tibet is the ancient culture.
Right.
It's ancient or more ancient than the Romanian culture.
Well, and in your book, you infer that it went back to Atlantis, right?
Lemuria.
Okay.
Go back to Lemuria, which is more ancient than Atlantis.
And when we go to that, are we thinking off-planet people, or, do you delve into that at all? You didn't really bring up any of that in the book.
No, I don't. But in my other books, I go into the off-planet connection with Tibet, the blue race, the Rh negative, the Lama, the original Dalai Lama, whatever they called him, the head Lama, which is really the Dalai Lama, way back before there were Buddhists, was by tradition of blue skin. Of blue skin. And in the book, books, The Black Sun, and in more extensively, that's extensive, but even more extensively in the book, Montauk Book of the Living, I go into the ancient heritage of the blue race connecting to the planet Mars. Okay? We're taking it back to Mars. Right. And that the physical human body on Earth has a biological clock that is concomitant with the orbit of Mars.
Which book is that in?
The Montauk Book of the Living, okay, and The Black Sun.
Okay.
These are both very deep books that go into a lot of different threads. And so anyway, this is sort of, when we're talking about these things, these are background threads.
Right.
Of Spandau Mystery is based upon. Not so much the blue race here. Where we do get into the off-planet in Spandau Mystery is the fascinating connection with the Dropa people, who are the little people of Tibet.
Right.
I've seen them in some, first it was a History Channel. I saw these like little people that the Nazis were glad-handing. And according to stories, there were these hybrid race of people that crashed from a craft and hybridized with the local Tibetans, and they were very short. And I have a whole tribute in the book to little people. I have little people, and I include a midget colony that was on Coney Island, which is where I practiced Qigong, is on Coney Island, not in the amusement park, but in a nearby park.
Interesting.
But the thing is, there was a midget colony there in the early 1900s, which burned down. I take a couple of characters out of that midget colony and put them into the book. They have supernatural properties or aspects, and they become time travelers, the little people. They have their own little time travel. I didn't tie the time travel machine into a Coney Island amusement ride. That would have been a good idea.
Yeah, definitely. So do you think because of these Tibetans, because of this ancient culture, is one reason that China's gone in and taken over Tibet, or you think that's unrelated?
It has a lot to do with it. China has always attempted historically to dictate. There's a whole new book, and I haven't read it, new a few years ago, on the relationship between China and Tibet. It's not what it appears. There's a very strong Jewish contingency in China by tradition. China and the upper echelons will assert that they're Jewish. And this is a lot of cultures will be secretly Jewish. They won't want to admit it for many reasons. But they will, if you get them behind closed doors and they open up to you, I am really Jewish. Now, part of the reason for that is that there was a silk trade route that went all the way from Morocco to Beijing. And who controlled the trade route? Who were the greatest traders? The Jews.
Right.
And they traded all the way. So there's whole Jewish colonies in China. The Jewish, you go back to Solomon, if you give any credence to that story, the diaspora that occurred after he died, everybody was from that area practically, or half the population at least. So you have everybody, you have the Ethiopians were Jewish. Jewish has no discrimination. Although it is a very, what do you call it? It's got a lot of genocidal characteristics in the Bible, the Jews, and committing genocide. They have a lot of, what's this word? Racism, or,
right.
And,
elitism, kind of.
Elitism, but they are very diverse as a culture, very diverse.
There's some kind of pretty, I'd say highly intelligent, seeding that's there, whatever we call that, wherever that's from.
Yes, but the conflict between China and Tibet, you had a very strong Nazi contingent that was present in Tibet pre-World War II. The Dalai Lama was tutored by SS officers. He was tutored, and so he not only had a connection to the CIA, he had a strong connection to the Nazis.
Is our current Dalai Lama or a different one?
Dalai Lama, yes. Okay, he was tutored by Nazis because they occupied the territory. The British also had an interest there. The Americans visited. I mean, it's not like the Nazis owned Tibet, but they had a very strong influence there. And they wanted an influence there. The Chinese were much more sympathetic, if not driven by Jewish interests. And you had this port of, I think it was Shanghai, was the only port that would accept Jews during World War II. Everybody else would say, go home. Shanghai would accept Jews. And one of the members of the Communist Politburo was a Jewish man from the Bronx who owned a bagel store in the Bronx, and he married a Chinese actress in, I think, Hong Kong. And when she escaped back into China during World War II with him, and they made him a member of the Politburo, and he was American Jewish. So, and he was on it, into the days of Mao. So there is a, there's always conflicts behind the conflicts that you don't see, and hidden history of that culture.
Well, Peter, let's take about 10 more minutes, 5 more minutes. I'm trying to keep these a little shorter than they have been, and you and I think could go on for hours and hours and hours. It's just so obvious that you're just a repository for so much information. It's amazing, and it comes out in your books. I want to encourage people to look for your books, look them up on Amazon, look them up through the links we'll put under this video. And your work is really, 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 really engaging. And I think it covers a lot of things that feed into this interweaving of who we are, why we're here, where we're going, and how we can take this now and turn it into something that really makes sense for the future of humanity. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions, because I know you've been very involved with Montauk and some locations on the planet that are where major grid lines come together, where major energetic things can take place. And because you're teaching so much about time travel, I'm just curious, have you time traveled, or how do you relate to that in your own personal life?
I'll tell you how I relate to it. It is something I've time traveled once in a dream. It was spectacular. When I was first writing the Montauk Project with Preston, he took me back to 1943. It's a very interesting dream. I mean, I'm sitting there on what looks like a stove coil, but it's big in this it's like a closet in a dilapidated underground. He said, "What are we doing?" He says, "It's okay." He's taking me back in time. He gets on one, I get on one. It's like Star Trek. Where are we? It's like, oh, we're in 1943. And we walk out and there's these old army trucks, like 1943 army trucks. And we run into Duncan Cameron, the time traveler from the Montauk Project. And he's sitting in a flatbed. And he looks at me and he looks at me, he says, "There's some equipment that needs to be fixed back there." What the hell are you telling me for? I'm doing all this. What the hell are you telling me? I'm not even an electronics person. Okay, now this only recently made sense. Now, no, I don't time travel in the sense that I have one friend who I've seen time travel. She was the first one to write in from the Montauk Project after reading it and say, "I was part of these experiments." And her move in time in a very weird way. And she says, "Yes, I see multiple timelines." And it tortures her. She's had a tough life. So I have not. That's the only time I've seen somebody time travel.
Right.
I have a friend, Dave Anderson, who never really talks about time traveling, but I'm sure he has experienced it. I know he experienced it, but it's not something he talks about. Now, an astrologer just 2 days ago, and I said this on the air yesterday with Mona Radler, she's an astrologer, but an astrologer looked at my chart and we were talking about, because I didn't tell you this, I'm being sought after by a major space agency to actually mentor a time travel program.
Wow.
I said, "What the hell is this? I'm not a scientist. I'm not an engineer."
Right.
I have demonstrated a very keen and peculiar understanding in the videos that I put out.
Right.
That's academic understanding.
Right.
And it's very abstract. I don't claim to be able to do this. And then I realized that, well, it's the psychology. So people react to this time reactor stuff that's on the website. They either get it like you do and say, "Oh, this is fascinating," yes, but there's some people who just shut down.
Right. Well, the thing is, I think ultimately we are going to experience this as a natural part of our being, but there's an adaptation that has to take place. First, we've got to comprehend it and then embrace it.
A long-winded answer to your question.
Yeah.
And to explain how it fits in is that what is lying here is the psychology of time travel. So I'm putting together a new series, which is available. 3 of them are available, but a whole course on the psychology of space-time, particularly the quantitative psychology of space-time, which involves dimensions. So I'll be explaining the dimensions up to the 10th dimension so people can harmonize between the dimensions and understand them much better. They'll have a much better reference frame to promote the psychology of being able to withstand time travel. So if I get involved in any such project, it's going to be from dealing with the psychology of the people involved, who are very likely to go off the deep end if they start creating technology that is beyond their psychological capability to deal with.
Right.
But to answer your question, I have in my chart, according to this astrologer, and it involves the asteroid Chiron, is I will be in Uranus, in my 10th house. I will be involved with the technology of time travel. Now that's something I never really thought. I wrote about it with Preston Nichols. And from my understanding of the occult or magic, when you grasp the theory of something, or really grasp the theory and understand it, the pragmatic will manifest.
Mm-hmm. Right.
To the degree I understand it, the pragmatic is inclined to manifest. So it would say, to answer your question, not involved, other than the fact that we're all involved in all these dimensions all the time, we're just not aware of it, but in a pragmatic, practical sense, it appears that I will be doing something along those lines as the future unfolds.
Nice. And this is a quantum world. So in my book, I write about, the nebulousness of time and space both. And when I think about it, if I think, I am couple of questions, just without going in too far. One is, what about the old question that's come up as we've looked at time travel over the last 10 or 15 years? Do we mess things up when we go to some other point in time? And then
we've already messed things up.
We've already messed things up.
This is what the Montauk Project is. We're now in a phase of correction. This is what David Anderson is. He is correcting. According to the lore of the Montauk Project, which I've created, is that the Anderson family are the custodians of time, and they're there to correct what went wrong.
Interesting.
And apparently I have a role to play in that. This would seem to be what's on the table.
And then the other thing is, when I think about traveling in time or teleporting, moving through space more easily, thinking of a place and being there, I'd kind of rather teleport than I would travel in time for some reason. At least that's what I'm more motivated to do right now. So how do you think that relates to the whole thing?
Well, in the book Transylvania Moonrise, they call that a space translation. And there is a space translation described in some detail that takes them from Transylvania to Tibet. Blue goddess Mashandi. Phantasmagorical is how the author describes it. But yes, these things are going to be phantasmagorical. So a space translation is different than a time translation. They're two different functions, but they can't help but be a little related because time and space are so tied together.
True. Peter, I want to just thank you so much for being here with me today. And I'm sure we could have many of these kind of conversations ongoing, and perhaps we will. Meanwhile, I'd like to encourage people to check out your books at skybooks.usa.com and on Amazon, and then your time travel website, which is again?
TimeTravelEducationCenter.com. You can get the book Spandau Mystery either on Amazon or probably more quickly at skybooks.usa.com.
Perfect. And I want to remind all of our listeners out there, breathe, smile, center in your own heart, live in your joy, and we are together creating a new earth that makes sense and will bring peace and plenty to all. Many blessings. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.